Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 2, I'm going to be talking to 8 South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today we chat with author and editor Shweta Taneja. Shweta is the author of the Innate Tantrist urban fantasy series, the best-selling non-fiction children's book They Found What, They Made What, and a new science fiction novel for kids, Kungfu Aunty vs. Garbage Monsters. We discuss world building, dark humor, writing urban fantasy for an Indian audience, tantrism, patriarchal power structures, and forging your own destiny. You can follow Shweta on Twitter @ShwetaWrites. Hi, Shweta. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
Thank you very much, Anjali, and thanks for having me here as well. I'm very excited about it.
Oh, we're very excited to have you. And, I can't wait to discuss the books because I think I haven't seen too much urban fantasy in the Indian literary landscape, and it's really fascinating to kind of start off with this series. But before we delve into that, could you tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer, how you got started? Did you always want to be one?
Well, that's a very interesting question you ask, Anjali, because no, I did not want to be a writer for a very long time when I was growing up. I had other dreams. I wanted to be a teacher, maybe. And then things happened as I was starting to get into my education and by figuring out, and then I wanted to be a journalist. And I did become a journalist for the initial career years of my life. It was journalism that kind of pushed me into thinking that I want to write and create new worlds through fiction. And it was writing stories of others where new characters came to my head whose stories I wanted to write, in fact. And through those stories, get deeper into our own world, because fiction has a way, I think we build a world with lies, but it actually tells us a lot more truth about our own selves. And I wanted to explore that as a writer. And so it was just like a unthought, natural direction for me to take from journalism to writing fiction. And it wasn't a day, it wasn't a voila, today I start writing fiction. It was just a challenge that I took on that, okay, this sounds difficult, let me try it. And then it was kind of addictive. So I love it and I hate it, but I continue to write fiction all this while.
I think that's the most honest portrayal about the writing process I've ever heard. You love it, but you hate it. I think everyone who writes can empathize with that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, writing remains, especially fiction, I would say, and my first love, which is speculative fiction, remains the most difficult for me to write, but it also remains the most challenging and exhilarating when it ends up becoming something, becoming a book in this case.
How did you get into speculative fiction? Were there any particular books or movies or TV shows that really influenced your storytelling?
I think speculative fiction also kind of slowly grew onto me. As a child, I was reading more mysteries and detective fiction, and that was fascinating. And I also got into mythology. In India, it's interesting that mythology seems to be its own genre rather than being called speculative fiction as such. So I started out in mythology, and it was through mythology that I got more and more interested in supernatural and mythology of other worlds, so to speak, and then wanted to write a speculative fiction myself. That's the direction it took. I think it took from mystery to mythology and to speculative fiction. To answer your question on the kind of influences that happened to me at that time, I think mostly it was the TV series that I can think of as Supernatural. That was with those two hot men. I mean, that was a very cool series which mixes up Christian mythology in a Western world very nicely with your urban world. And that's a similar kind of story that I wanted to delve into with my speculative fiction and urban mythology to create an urban fantasy, so to speak. Yeah.
It's so interesting that you mentioned mythology in that way, because I don't think a lot of people think of it as the first speculative fiction that we actually have heard of. Because in India, we grow up on these stories, and they're our first introduction, I think, to magic and myths.
And to superheroes. I mean, Krishna was a superhero. When I wrote him, I'm like, okay, these are the superhero genres that I've been reading forever, like Superman or Spider-Man. Krishna's our superhero. But we don't define it as such because for a lot of people, it's also real. Mythology of our country is history. It merges with history, I think. And that makes it more difficult to take it in speculative field because it's living mythology for us. I think the gods still live in the country along with us, unlike Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology, where nobody's living with these myths anymore. These stories are still alive, still changing constantly amongst us. So, yeah, it's an interesting concept.
I think that's a really great way of looking at it, because you've pinpointed the reason why Indian mythology is still a genre to itself, whereas I think other mythology kind of ebbs and flows. And there's been a consistent love and appreciation for Indian mythology in the literary field.
Yeah, I feel there's something about living mythology. I bet your family has some stories of some characters from our collective mythology, which are completely different stories that my family would have. And I love how there are different versions of these stories living with different communities and different families and different parts of the country or even Asia. I mean, Thailand has, for example, a very different Ramayana than India has. And as a storyteller, I am more interested in seeing different versions rather than figuring out what's truth or not. That's not my concern. I want to see what different versions of these stories tell about us, about the people who are carrying these versions within us. I go into philosophy when I think about stories because stories really help us grow, right? It kind of, they go deep into us and they affect our decisions, our ethics, our morals. And the stories we carry in us as a society really help define the direction that the society will take. And that's what fascinates me about science fiction, which is the future of a society, with our past, which is the mythology, so to speak, the stories that we are carrying in us. And building that bridge in speculative fiction is what I enjoy writing about.
Before I get carried away and go into this, because it's a fascinating discussion, I kind of want to touch on going back to your influences. In your work, there's a lot of, I think, a combination of quite dark humor and, of course, this kind of slapstick, crazy capers, you know? Are there any authors who influenced you in that direction?
Oh, definitely. So I love humor, and I've been a long fan of two immediate authors in speculative fiction that I can think of, which is Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett. I mean, I have read and reread again all these books of theirs. And I really feel science fiction as a genre, speculative fiction as a genre, does not have enough humor. I mean, life is hilarious. Life as it happens to all of us as we tumble through it, even real life. We hate it at that time, but it is funny. There are so many moments that humor can bring out in a story that I want to explore that aspect of things. And Terry Pratchett's works, I think, and I've been recently rereading, I think for the umpteenth time, Going Postal. I don't know if you've checked that book out. I mean, it's very well written. I didn't know there was a TV series, by the way, Anjali, about it. I just found out recently. Yeah, BBC brought out like 2 seasons of Going Postal. So anyway, for listeners who don't know about Going Postal, it's, I think, one of the really nice Discworld books of Terry Pratchett's. I won't say the best because each of the Terry Pratchett fan I've met over the years has their favorite. And I don't want to cause that controversy. Maybe our listeners can tell us what they like, which ones of his books they like. But anyway, there's this character who's called Moise. He's a con artist and he's about to be hanged, but he's saved by the patrician and made the postmaster because the patrician sees the potential of this conniving guy in becoming a smart businessman. And that's the whole premise. He has to save the post office and he has to save, himself from assassins who are trying to destroy the post office. This book for me, Anjali, has so many elements that are just right about old technology versus new technology, that theme, for example, or how big businesses abuse the power that they have.
I love this book. And one of the things that always strikes me is that the patrician kind of brings in a con man to run the post office.
Yeah, isn't that a brilliant plot? I mean, I loved it. That your underdog is somebody who is about to be hanged, and you still empathize with that character. As a reader, of course, I love it, but as a writer also, I feel that the characters are so well written. The world is so beautifully, fleshed out in every scene. The dialogues for each of these characters. And then the world, how little elements. Yeah, it's a fascinating read in how to bring humor. For me as a writer also, it kind of inspires me to bring in that humor in situations which are otherwise in the plot, quite filled with tension. And I think that trick is what I totally picked up from Terry Pratchett for Innate Tantrist series. So Innate Tantrist series, as you know, is a tantric detective based in Delhi, and she's solving supernatural crime, fighting monsters and supernatural creatures from Indian mythology, very Indian that way. But as this action is happening, the humor element, I think, is what makes it richer. And I was laughing creating these scenes. I think I was having such a great time just building these hilarious scenes.
I think reading the book, that's what stood out for me. As I was reading it, I was like, this is written by somebody who's having fun. And I'm glad you've confirmed that for me.
Oh, yeah. I was laughing out loud every time I created some wacky scene or the other in this series.
And I think something that Pratchett does very well is kind of mix in some very emotional and traumatic things with a really big dose of humor. For example, in Going Postal, there is this whole subplot of, actual murder and assassination and things like that. And those are quite hard things to comprehend.
I think so too. You're right, Anjali. It's very well put. The way he kind of brings out, I feel he understands as a writer that even in the biggest tragedies of life, there is humor to be had. I love that his characters, even as they're about to die, or even after they die, sometimes they meet death as a character. And they're like, oh, we're dead. Oh, but I wanted that favorite samosa of mine. Literally that, right? And it's pathos at its most beautiful.
Though I must say, some of the things that he caricatures are like, it's like poking someone with a sharp, pointy stick, like you're reading about it and you're like, oh, this extremely backward place where vampires run like free. And then, like, obviously it's like this kind of gothic setup with werewolves and things like that. And you're like, who's he mocking? But I think that's the funny part is you can kind of decide that for yourself. And that's the fun.
Fair enough. And I guess the worlds that fantasy build in, it is as a reader up to us to find our truth in it, maybe, because the writer's inspiration and intention might be totally different than what the reader sees in those worlds. I think that's the beauty of fantasy or science fiction also, because they're not really real worlds. They're not like even inspired fiction from real world. It could be an alternate world. But we are trying to find our own realities in those works, in those worlds that a writer's built. And their reality Terry Pratchett's reality is completely probably different from what mine as a reader is, from yours, Anjali, as a reader. And it says something about the writer, right? If our takeaways are different from what he's written as a writer. And the reader takeaway is completely different, and it can still be an emotional, beautiful takeaway from that book.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the mark of someone who's a master at the craft, in that you see yourself in all those stories. And if you don't, you still are able to appreciate and love them anyway.
Yeah. You not only see yourself, you also see reflections of your own world. I think that is what makes a sustained writer who will be read decades from now rather than instantly.
If we're left to our own devices, we could talk about Pratchett for the next couple of hours. But I do want to touch on the Innate Tantrist series, and I want to get into your work. But before we chat about that and you do your reading, I'd actually like to tell our readers a little bit about the books and our protagonist, Anantya, who is a badass tantrist private detective, constantly combating the memories of her traumatic childhood to save the day. She rubs shoulders with gods, rakshasas, and other supernaturals regularly. And though she's really been running from her past, it's about to catch up with her. And that's the point where we meet her. And now I'll kind of give you the floor to do a short reading from The Cult of Chaos, which is your first book in the series.
Yeah. Thank you, Anjali. I'm actually going to read a little bit from the first chapter of the book, of the first book of the series, where we meet Anantya when she's on a date. She's not been on a date since 7 years. And this is Delhi. So a friend of hers has fixed a date for her. And the guy is a little overprotective in a very Delhi fashion. And when he finds out she's not had a date since such a long time, he assumes that she might be a virgin, she has no experience. And this is a tantric detective who's like fighting monsters deep in the night, and he has no idea about this. And she does tell him that she's a tantric. He laughs in her face because she's all up for a change and, wearing lipstick tonight or something. He doesn't believe. He thinks that she's joking. So then finally, there's a guy who kind of grabs Anantya, an unknown, and Nikhil, her date's protective instincts wake up. And that's where I'm going to start reading this book. What is the meaning of this? Nikhil hollered, his face pink with anger. How dare you touch her? Where's your manager? I want to speak to him. Sit down, Nikhil, I said quietly. My hands reached for the bone blade in my satchel. I was glad I had brought it along. Although I had left my belted scabbard at home, fashion can be lethal for a tantric. Nikhil pushed the table away with a loud screech and rose to his intimidating 6 feet. Not that that would save him from a disgruntled Rakshasa. He lunged, grabbed the waiter. Let go of her, he bellowed. The waiter sank to his knees, his face still blank, his eyes empty, his left hand still frozen on my right arm. Poor guy, he didn't really have a choice. I turned in one swift moment and slashed the waiter's torso from his throat at the right collarbone to the solar plexus with my bone blade. Blood erupted and scattered my face and hair. A loud screech echoed somewhere behind me. Ah, that was Nikhil. Nikhil screamed, his hand dropping from the waiter's shoulder as he sprang back. The waiter slumped to the floor in a pool of blood. Nikhil, I tried to say. Unfortunately, the hand I brought up was my left, which had my bone blade pointed at him. You stay away from me, Nikhil screamed, his eyes as big as saucers, stepping backwards away from our cubicle. Okay, I didn't have time for this. He shouldn't leave the bubble that I had created, not until I had completed my mantra. Springing up from the sofa, I leapt onto the table and grabbed hold of Nikhil's gelled hair and yanked him towards me. Don't hurt me, he said again. I have friends in high places. You, I said, you listen to me carefully. You have to stay close. If you make one move away from me, I will slash your neck and use your skull as a kapala. He looked at me blankly. You, he said, you are a tantric. Ahem. I scratched my throat. Remember how just a minute ago you thought I was too gorgeous to be a tantric? Why don't you stick with that thought, be a good boy, and sit quietly, let me deal with this shit?
Thank you. That was so wonderful and a great introduction to Anantya, because I think she is kind of what is encapsulated in that scene. She's very badass. She's very physical and kind of like ready for action at any given point of time. So, getting into the books, really, why Tantrism? Do you have some kind of personal connection to it? Or is there some kind of story behind it? Why did it capture attention?
That's a good question, Anjali. I think, as I was saying, that I was interested in Indian mythology and I was reading quite a lot of stuff from Puranas and stuff. And it kind of took me into the dark side of mythology, which slowly took me to the stories that we had left behind as we became more civilized, quote unquote. And the stories were bloodier and darker. And I think as a society, we did not need those stories anymore. And as I kept going in that direction in my research, I reached Tantrism, which is an occult practice that all of us kind of know about but not know about. We associate it with dark magic or gaining power, which it is as well. But the thing is that as a practice, as a witchery practice, occult practice almost, it has its own texts, it has its own, cults and groups and collectives, and it has its own beliefs, which is like about lying at the edges of a mainstream society. And it kind of attracts people who are at the very, very edges of the mainstream society, either pushed out because they did not fit in or they cannot fit in. I think that fascinated me about Tantrism, and I started to research in depth in it. The idea that was behind it was that I wanted to write an urban fantasy series which was Indian in its fabric, Indian in its spirit, so to speak, and not inspired by Eurocentric myths that I was reading, which was vampires or werewolves or, which do not have stories in our traditional societies, which are almost, or zombies, for example. I've always wondered if India had zombies, they would probably melt away because it's a cold country syndrome, right? Maybe they'll survive in Himalayas. That's my logic.
I love that. We are saved from the zombie apocalypse because of global warming.
I think so. I think zombies will just melt away, right? They're dead flesh if you look at it logically, and it's the freeze that protects them or, ensures that they don't melt away. What I was trying to say is that I wanted to bring out, folklore stories in the blood of this country that I'd grown in. So that attracted me to Tantrism. And once I delved deeper into it, I realized that there can be a whole alternate power center in India that can run in parallel to our real, what we perceive as humans, reality kind of thing. And that's how this book came together, I think, as a world.
It's interesting that you mentioned the fringes of society, because in your books, Tantrism has kind of come out of the shadows and is now very openly a part of the government. It's a very recognized thing now. Why did you make that decision in this world that you've built? Why is it out in the open? And why are the supernatural so out in the open?
The supernaturals are not completely out, at least not all kinds. In Delhi, they in fact need a visa requirement to immigration process to stay in Delhi, and they need to hide their true self behind a human veneer. So a lot of humans go through assuming that you are human, but you turn out to be supernatural. That's the crux of this book, right? But tantrics, a certain kind of tantrics are out, which are the most muted ones who have the most ambition in terms of being out there and grabbing power, political power and people power. So those are out, but the kind of tantrism that Anantya is doing, which is related with blood, she uses blood magic. That one is illegal in the tantric alternate world that is there. So they are out. And I feel the decision was very easy in this case because when you look at India, we are much more accepting of beliefs and supernatural, of babas and, of gurus and whatnots. that if there is tantric magic in the world, then you would be accepting if there's an ashram, selling you totkas, for example, or you might even enjoy it or something. And tantric sex is something that's been exported part of tantrism, which is like, really orgasmic sex in certain positions or something, which in the books is a way that male tantrics would gain power out of females. I do feel that if tantrics were out there and they can perform magic, politicians would probably go there, and like astrologers would take their help to win elections. It was just a given to build that world in that direction, just logical, I would say.
And what really inspired Anantya's character? She's the only openly female tantric, and it's a difficult yet fascinating life because she is very much on the fringes of tantric society itself. Why did you choose her to be the protagonist and have the books be from her point of view?
That's an interesting question to think about, actually. She came to me from another book, which was a failure in itself. It was her name, actually, not her character, just her name, Anantya, came to me from a book that I was trying to write, which died in a few chapters on vengeance. So I knew two things, that she's angry and she's called Anantya. And when I put her together with Tantrism, I also knew that the tantric world is very male oriented. So for her to have that space to become the detective she was, she would have had a very checkered past. And she would have had, like, experiences that made her want to break away from the mainstream, tantric society, which is much more chauvinistic than our modern world and very hierarchical and very gendered. She would have to go through some experiences which are probably illegal and unacceptable for that society also. So it was interesting that Tantrism itself is a fringe of our society. And in a way, I was trying to see what is unacceptable, what is the fringe of the tantric society as well. So it's a fringe of a fringe in that sense, where Anantya is based, because she's illegal in a world which is illegal for our mainstream world. So I was like putting that layer into her character. The fact that she walks the night in Delhi and the fact that I chose Delhi was personal. I grew up in Delhi and I was a young journalist in Delhi, and I was, traveling around in the night. And I never felt safe. Delhi wasn't safe in the 90s for women, in the 2000s that I was doing journalism. It still isn't for a lot of women out there, in the night especially. So I was always walking with, how growing up in India, you kind of grow these extra senses where you always look around and you're always walking with awareness. So I wanted to walk those streets with Anantya. She's fearless. She walks those streets as she owns them, really. She doesn't need any 6-foot Nikhil to protect her. And she, in fact, goes out to protect the people who need protection, the underdogs of her society. So I think that was a selfish thing also for a writer like me, because I was exploring that world with her and hoping that I get over the fears that I built in myself while I was growing up, but also hoping that my readers, when they read about this woman in Delhi in the night, can walk the streets fearlessly, I think. And that has come back to me in a couple of times. And I think that's been really the character, how she built up, yes.
Anantya actually reminds me very strongly of one of my childhood inspirations, which was Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh, yeah. So I haven't seen that series. I would actually like to read or see it. I haven't yet. I know Buffy is like really cool, right? It's super fun, right?
She's kind of an icon. I think you'll really enjoy it. We have to do a kind of cultural exchange. I'll go watch Going Postal, and you have to go watch Buffy.
Yeah. Yeah, Buffy, I have no two shoots about. I think I'll really enjoy that series. Yeah.
Back to Anantya, her upbringing plays a really big part in the series. In a very real sense, she grew up in a cult. And that continues to have a very strong hold on her and her actions, even though she's trying to move away from the things she learned as a child. Obviously, trauma lingers. And also, her prejudices, her way of thinking is very formed by her, upbringing. So, why was it important for her to have that journey of kind of decolonizing her mind as well?
I think the kind of upbringing that she had was very, very repressed. We don't clearly know who her mother is. We kind of find out about it in the third part of the series. But she grew up with a father who really abused her power. So in the world, women have something called Shakti. Shakti is the source, the magic source, the energy that can be used to do magic. So she was used by her father to kind of be an assassin and have sex with other old men to get that energy out of her because that was supposed to be her duty. So if you've grown up in such a conservative, repressed household where your own father kind of puts you out there and hangs you, and she has had a series of abuse before we meet her when she's in her 20s and living in Delhi and is a detective. I think that leaves scars, as you rightly put, Anjali, that puts in prejudices. And there is this anger in her, especially when she sees any form of abuse in the society. She is really like, sometimes she even acts rashly to counter that abuse and to counter the wrongs that she sees in the society. She has that, and that all stems from her personal past experiences that still haunt her, I think. Through the three books, I would say there are certain things, especially her relationship with her father, that I have explored, which kind of get resolved in a certain way. For good or not, I don't know. She also finds out more about her mother in a good or not way. I am not sure either. But that's how her journey has been. I mean, life kind of throws pickles at you and you relook at your whole thing and see how your past has been and it was completely probably a sham or something. I think that made it an interesting character for me to be with also because you would assume there was something good that she was attracted to and maybe she will choose to save the world or something, but she does not. She wants to not pick up any legacy and build her own path ahead. I think that's where she was.
There's also a strong indictment of the patriarchy throughout the books. First through Anantya's treatment, and then in the stories of all the female identifying characters, regardless of their race and species. And one of the foundational aspects of Tantrism is stealing female energy or Shakti. So, could you elaborate as to why you went in that direction?
I think somewhere when I was writing this, and it was consciously that I wanted to talk about gender. And I wanted to talk about gender through an entertaining story. So Innate Tantrist series, and the first is an entertaining story. It's not a saga on gender or, something that only women will talk about or women will read. But I wanted to create a entertaining thriller, but also talk about gender, class, caste in our society. And speculative fiction as a whole is a very interesting mirror, isn't it? Because through the monsters or through us versus them or what's happening to the characters, you kind of reflect upon your own society because it's an alternate society. You kind of get sneaked into it. And then you reflect on the prejudices that you have built up as a person or your society has, and maybe question them. So it's a snidey, evil thing to do to place these themes into an entertaining detective fiction, so to speak. But that's the fun part.
I think power dynamics are a very important part of these books. And at times, Anantya is the prey, and at times, she's the predator. And throughout, there's a thread of real disdain for authority. And so when she becomes the powerful one, I mean, without giving away too much, she kind of rejects it. And why was that a crucial part of the story and her development?
I think it was a very crucial point. You rightly point that, Anjali. Thanks for asking this question. I feel she does reject it because she has seen how power corrupts. She's seen that in her parents, she's seen that in all the villains she's come across. And she somewhere maybe fears that power will corrupt her in certain ways. She does not want to be a leader, so to speak, a strong, powerful leader who people look up to blindly. She wants them to figure out their own shit, mostly, She's like, I don't want to be this powerful person who's like, weaving society, shaping up societies. But that's her journey. And at that point, even I, as a writer, was surprised that she will step away from something that she perhaps would have liked to do. I did not know that she would step away from this while writing her. It was at that scene that I realized that, okay, she's stepping away. She's not accepting this anymore. She's rejecting the legacy that is being passed on to her. The whole idea of chosen ones, right? That's such a typical trope that comes into fantasy and science fiction, that you are the chosen one and it is your destiny to do XYZ. Chosen one is a very blood related monarchist kind of an argument, I would say, in a book. And if that's the opportunity you get, that's the reason you get, because of your privilege, because of your blood or your caste, I don't know, because of your class, if you get that opportunity, that perhaps is not a given. It's heroes should come from people who have really like worked towards it, not because of their blood, is what I have always thought.
And I think Anantya is someone who kind of desperately wants to forge her own destiny. She's never had much control over her own life. And as we come to learn, even less than she realized.
Yeah, I think that pisses her off, doesn't it? I mean, the whole like being out of control and figuring that somebody else was doing all of this for her to become a something. It would piss me off. What do you say, Anjali, if you figured that all the steps that you're taking in your life, somebody's planned it? Yeah, so I guess Anantya did the right thing.
I think also, especially as you become more familiar with her in the books, you realize that she's had a pretty terrible life in that she's been really exploited. She's been kind of abandoned by people who should care about her. Traditionally, family ties are supposed to be nurturing ones. And at the end of it, you realize that even the people who she trusts in a limited way have kind of betrayed her. So it is extraordinary to me that one, that she's able to give up this power because she spent so much time being helpless. And the other is that she's still a little naive and open. She still kind of believes a little bit in people's innate goodness, which is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah, she does, doesn't she? She would hate it if you tell her that. Yeah, she'll totally deny it, though.
I think somewhere only towards the end of the series, I realized that she's 23. And I was thinking, God, when I was 23, I was extremely clueless.
Yeah, I think her journey has been quite spectacular, right? I think that's what makes her, for me, a fascinating character in a book because of the kind of richness that her journey has in both good and bad ways. I was just writing a couple of weeks ago her origin story, and that's going to release soon in India in an anthology, a short story. Yeah, and I touched base with her after years because I finished this in 2018, this series that we are talking about. And it was nice to see how she figured out that she wanted to be a detective, so to speak. I didn't know this till now. As a writer, you go back to the person and you ask her that question because she was a druggie before this, and completely like hopeless, and her experiences had been so dramatically sad that she had lost everything mentally, emotionally, all will to live. And to go from there to not only survive but become a tantric, become a detective, and get that power in her, get that opportunity. It was an interesting story for me to write, to see how she got that motivation in her, right, to do this.
My next question was going to be, do you think you'll revisit Anantya?
It wasn't planned, but it just happened. There's a detective anthology that's going to release, and the editor approached me to write a story, and I had thought about Anantya's origin. I thought, okay, maybe that's the detective story I want to tell. So yeah, I did write another story of hers.
This is the best kind of surprise.
Thanks. It was a surprise for me as well. It's quite nice.
Before we kind of wrap things up, I also wanted to ask, Anantya really doesn't appreciate immortality and divinity. She's a little heretical, has a real disdain for the gods and for people who are considered divine. Why was that an important part of her personality? That was something that it keeps cropping up in all these books. And how the devas are portrayed in particular is quite interesting to me. Why did you choose to explore it that way?
I have thought a lot about immortals and if immortals were living in India. And there's, in fact, another short story of mine, which explores immortals meeting together in a conference where they are trying to collectively figure out how to die. This is a really funny, weird short story, which is again going to release in another anthology later this year. And I always feel that the concerns that creatures who live longer than humans, like say trees or, devas in this case, or divinities, have very different concerns than humanity. And sometimes that also makes them cruel, really, almost to the short lived ones, almost like humans are cruel to insects. So I think that has colored maybe my writing in terms of Anantya's character also. But there are two things. She doesn't like the powerful, in this case, it's the divine, interfering with the living or the life choices of humans or other creatures who do not have that power. And I think that makes her inherently suspicious of anyone who has the power to either live longer than the next door neighbor or, has lived that long that they're twisted in the head.
I think that's a very valid thought process because I think in a lot of stories, immortality is something people are searching for, but I don't think they reckon with the reality of what it is, which we see in this book where there are those who wouldn't give it up for the world. And there are those who've kind of become so steeped in it that it is time for them to move on.
And that they're desperate to die. I always feel like if you've lived 10,000 years, maybe you just want to die and see what's out there, what next, kind of a thing. There's another short story that I did about immortals that I just mentioned, which is going to release in another anthology, and both of them haven't announced their names yet, so I can't even talk about it beyond this. I also have a book for kids coming out, a really funny science fiction, but again, I cannot mention more about this because I don't have dates of release yet from my publisher.
Okay, but at least we know that there's something on the horizon that we should look out for.
Yes, thank you. Yes, definitely, Anjali. There are hopefully other things that are going to come out as well.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Shweta. It was such a pleasure talking to you and getting to know Anantya a bit better.
Thanks, Anjali. Thanks for having me. I wish you all the best for this.
Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.